This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Before we start today's video, I want to thank Carl and Steph for sending me a teleprompter. It was the next goal on my Patreon, but it was also on my Amazon wishlist, and thank you for your generosity. When I hit 100 patrons, instead of getting a new teleprompter, I'll probably invest in upgrading a few other pieces of equipment, like my ring light or definitely my tripod. But this was such a wonderful surprise and came in perfect timing. I'm about to shoot a bunch of videos, and having a teleprompter is going to be a terrific help. Before we begin, I want to address a scam going around YouTube where somebody impersonates the YouTuber in the comments and says something like, "Text me on Telegram." I hang out in the comments a lot, but trust me, I don't use Telegram. I'm not going to tell you in the comments that you won something. If you see something like that in my comments, it ain't me. Just making sure you have a heads up. And speaking of somebody impersonating somebody else for a while, a flawless segue, sometimes players can't make it to a session, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if you have maybe one or two players who can't make it to a game, you have to figure out how to handle it. Specifically, you need to figure out what happens with their player character. And there isn't one right way to do it. In your campaign, you might use half a dozen different solutions, or you might find a one-size-fits-all approach. Today, I'm just going to talk about some of the ways I can think of to explain away the fact that a player is not present. This is purely meant to get you thinking about some ways to approach this issue. And maybe the next time you find out 15 minutes before the game that somebody can't make it, you can go back to this video and figure out which solution will work best for your game. And I'm willing to bet that some of you have some other solutions I haven't thought of. Let me know in the comments below. What I don't want to hear is that one or more of these solutions doesn't work. You can point out weaknesses for them, sure. None of these approaches work perfectly for everybody's game because the tone and style of your game will determine what works best. But there's nothing on this list that just doesn't work. Everything on this list has worked for someone's group. It might not work for your campaign, and that's fine. But that probably means your campaign has different needs. Figuring out which approaches you most prefer can tell you a lot about your GM style and the vibe of your game, and that's valuable in all sorts of ways. I'm going to present these solutions in a vague order that reflects a spectrum of style. We'll start with the ones that have the most casual vibe, the ones where everyone is fully aware that we're playing a game and nobody tries to pretend we aren't doing exactly what we're doing. And by the end, we'll have the solutions that put their focus on reinforcing the secondary world and maintaining immersion and verisimilitude. So let's get into it. They're here, they're fine, don't worry about it. This is the most hand-waving away option. Instead of explaining their absence or having somebody else play the character or any of the other options ahead of us, you just acknowledge that they are with the group, and then you don't worry about it at all. It might not seem like this is the least realistic option. After all, some of these other examples will be much more explicit about the absence of the character along with the absence of the player. But that's specifically why this approach is, in my mind, so casual. We can all assume the character's present, but they won't ever take damage, and they won't contribute to a fight. There's no narrative explanation, just we're not worrying about it. You don't worry about the spells they have or the stuff in their backpack. That might not always be true. Some players might argue that this character would cast this spell to open the door, or they would pay for drinks, or whatever. But once that happens, I feel like that becomes a different approach. That character becomes an NPC, and we'll talk about that later. In fairness, most tables do not have to form hard lines like that. I'm just making a numbered list, so I have to draw some somewhat arbitrary distinctions. At your table, you can do whatever you want. But honestly, for this approach to work best, I really recommend that you don't have the player character spend or expend anything they have. Otherwise, that player is going to come back to find some stuff missing, and that is not an awesome feeling. If it's on their person, it's considered inaccessible. Imagine that their character sheet is basically behind glass. You've effectively replaced this character with a wax replica of them that is always with the party, but nobody worries about it. Everybody ignores the character, but they always come along with the party. Because if that character does leave the group for the same amount of time as the player is away from the group, now you're acknowledging that the game world has to have some internal consistency. And there are a few ways to do that. Yeah, they left. This is so similar to the first option that I already get the sense that I'm splitting hairs and some of these distinctions are completely arbitrary. In the scenario, the PC is not with the party, they left, but you don't worry about where they went or why. Honestly, you could throw in a throwaway joke about them being in the bathroom, or have the character say, "I'll follow right behind and cover our tracks." But honestly, mostly this is the same approach as the first. You just don't worry about this character at all. It's completely hands-off, and it also maintains the immersion in the world that the first solution sort of can't resolve. Everybody still knows what's happening. You certainly aren't fooling anybody. This honestly works better for certain characters than others. As I already said, maybe the ranger follows behind the group to cover their tracks. Or if you want to be slightly extra, the rogue can move ahead of the group, and you can describe how they've left little clues in Thieves' Cant about how to follow them through the dungeon. Maybe these clues are helpful. Or maybe they're useless because the rogue's handwriting is garbage or nobody else knows Thieves' Cant. So the players don't actually gain any tactical advantage. They're still playing through the adventure as you intended it. If the party's in a town, maybe this character has gone off to handle something simple, yet potentially time-consuming. Like, I'm going to perform recon on the warehouse. Or, I'll keep an eye on our gear in the tavern room while the rest of you go and handle this meeting. They are needed elsewhere. In my first LA games, I explained player absences by claiming that sometimes the gods would reach down and pluck heroes away, taking them somewhere else to go and do a mission. So when someone couldn't come to a session, they just vanished, blinking out of existence. And when they came back, they would appear out of nowhere next to the rest of the group, and they might be covered in webs or sand or goop or something to show that they had gone somewhere and had a whole separate adventure. This was the most simple, direct iteration of this idea, but there are tons of versions of this approach. For example, in the most recent episode of Critical Role Demystified, we discussed how Pike stayed in Vasselheim to help rebuild an ancient temple to her goddess. In the cartoon adaptation, she went to the temple to repair her holy symbol and heal her relationship with her goddess. Now, these don't have to be based on the gods, but gods and faith do lend themselves really nicely to a don't ask questions, it'll take as long as it takes approach, which is really handy when justifying absent D&D characters. And now a word from our sponsor. Another reason I leaned in on the gods as an explanation is because, personally, I love designing pantheons and gods for D&D. If left to my own devices, I'll keep adding new gods to my world endlessly, just because I think it's interesting. You might personally like to create kingdoms and foreign rulers, or you might like writing history about ancient wars between powerful spellcasters. But no matter where you find your bliss when world building, today's sponsor, World Anvil, can help you keep your thoughts in order. World Anvil is an online tool that you can use to create articles of anything in your setting, and link those articles together to form your own personal wiki for your world. It's absolutely the best way to collect your ideas, whether you're running an RPG campaign or writing a novel. They also have randomizer tools that you can use for inspiration for names, or cultural symbols, or prophecies, tavern names, ship names, anything you might need. That can be especially handy if a player is coming back to the table after an unexplained absence, and you need some inspiration for what they've been up to this whole time. You can save 40% off of any annual membership when you visit worldanvil.com and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. They left, and it's a good story. For another time. Here's the thing. I eventually stopped using the gods as a justification for absent characters. There was nothing wrong with that approach, but the tone of our game had changed. A few players had permanently left, a few others had permanently joined, and the campaign style was getting more serialized. Instead of just hand-waving away a character's absence, I wanted to find some justification that could actually connect into the story. So when the other PCs woke up, the player was missing. The campsite had been packed up, and there was a note that read, "Back soon." When that player returned, their character came back and had no memory of leaving, packing up their camp, or writing the note. Some other creature had possessed them and used them for some secret task. Now, you don't have to get quite so dramatic. If you're in town, maybe a noble comes to take them to a meeting of other important people to tell them about something going on. And when the player returns, they'll have an update about something relevant to your campaign. Or maybe they left to go do research, like Gandalf at the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. This approach usually works well if they can come back with some relevant information, or a mystery, or a clue to a side quest. We saw that the first time Pike rejoined the cast of Critical Role, back in the 4th episode, where she had a bit more information about the caves they were exploring. But maybe their absence should feel even more significant than that. Whoops, their absence just launched a brand new story arc. Some spoilers here for Critical Role Campaign 2. I will keep it vague, but if you don't want to know anything at all, jump to this timecode and you'll skip any reference of any kind. When a few members of the cast had to leave the show for a few weeks, Matt had to justify their absence. So they were abducted by bad guys, and the rest of the party had to track them down and rescue them, which was not an easy feat. In fact, that whole process took exactly as long as those players were scheduled to be away from the table. Funny how that worked out. And that story took over the campaign for 4 weeks, and it had some monumental ramifications, some of which were completely unexpected by the players or the DM, and they changed the trajectory and the tone of the entire campaign. We're getting to the point on the immersion spectrum where a character can't just leave without some big questions being asked. And so instead of avoiding those questions, this approach leans into them. Yes, it is weird that this player is gone for no reason. You should probably try to figure out what happened. This requires a lot more work to get prepared, so it really is best when you have some advance notice. More than like 15 minutes. Although I don't want you to think that it's not possible to whip up a scenario like this with very little notice, so if you've got an idea, you should go for it. This approach will also give the characters a chance to show how devoted they are to each other. In the Critical Role example, this arc made me far more excited about the campaign. It took characters who were really only working together out of convenience, and it challenged them to consider how far they'd be willing to go in order to protect each other. It gave the characters proper investment in the group that I'd felt was lacking for so much of the campaign up to that point. Now again, this doesn't have to be, and probably shouldn't be, a recreation of exactly what happened on Critical Role. You can look at something like the Gandalf example. When Gandalf comes back with lore, he doesn't just have a side quest for Frodo. His absence and his return launches a new story arc. So there's a potential for a lot of different types of storytelling in this category, but this is the most immersive way to remove the player character from the group. But there are still other ways to handle a player absence that continue to reinforce that the world of the game is real. They're a special kind of NPC. Instead of having the player character vanish, they stick around, but now they're just a special kind of NPC. Here, nobody has to think twice about what happened to the character. Nothing happened to them. They're right here. See? They're role-played by the DM outside of combat, but the reason I say special kind of NPC is to make it clear that the PC is still at least partially protected. In this scenario, they cannot die in combat, and maybe you don't track the resources this character spends, like spell slots and money, things they would do, but you don't want to spend their resources. Or maybe you do. This is up to you and your players. What makes the most sense and what is the most fair. Maybe you still have them fade into the background for combat, or maybe you still roll their attacks and damage like normal. They take their turn in initiative like normal. The idea behind being a special kind of NPC might mean that the player doesn't have to adjust their character sheet too much when they get back to the group, but it definitely means that nothing drastic will happen to that character when they're not present. The fact that this is a game with friends is still exerting an influence on the story and the world. So there is one step further down the immersion spectrum we can take this. They're here, and they're vulnerable. No special treatment. The PC can, and will, spend spell slots and money and resources as much as it makes sense to the other players at the table, including the DM. This PC is treated just like any other PC in combat. As for who runs the character, there are a few options. The first is that the DM handles the character in and out of combat. This is a lot of work, but it's the one that will give you the most narrative control. The second is that the DM handles the character as an NPC out of combat, but one or more players control their actions in combat. And the third is that the PC is entirely piloted by the other players. It should probably be up to the missing player to determine who pilots their character while they're gone. But before going down this road at all, make sure everyone is clear about whether a character death is on the table. This approach was used a few times on Critical Role, and there was a genuine threat of character death. That was on the table. And the first time the players realized this, some of them were shocked. This is why it's important to discuss your expectations and the potential consequences before taking this tactic, to make sure that this is not a rude surprise. But Matt's argument was that this is what the villains would do in this scenario. They would target that PC and try to kill them in battle. That's why, in my opinion, this is as far as you can go toward the immersion and verisimilitude end of the immersion spectrum. You're treating this like this is any ordinary game, like the party member is not absent. I don't personally think I would ever take this tactic, because it just doesn't jive with my style. But if you run a more hard-ass game, or a game where the story and the immersion is the most important part, then this might be fine for your group. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for indulging me as I get used to my new toy. I really like it. It's just going to take a little bit of time to get used to, but I can already tell this saved me so much time when filming this episode. If you want to support the channel, there are a few great ways to do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about new videos as soon as they come out, which is every Monday and Thursday. You can sign up for my Patreon. Any dollar amount really helps the channel, and I have certain goals that I hit when I have more patrons. Not more people donating more money, just more people helping at all. The third way to support the channel is by joining my Discord and being a part of a cool community of people hanging out and talking about D&D and stuff. And the fourth and final way to support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter to get occasional updates of what I've got going on. Until next time, play fair and have fun.